The morning Lucy Ralston received the notice, the sky over Dust Creek, Texas, was the color of a bruised purple and swollen along the horizon, pressing down on the flat land like a fist, and she stood on the porch of her homestead, reading the same 3 lines over and over as if they might change themselves if she stared long enough. They did not change. The paper in her hands was official, stamped with the seal of Harlan Boggs, Land Commissioner for Caldwell County, and the words were plain as the flat earth surrounding her. She had 3 days to vacate the property at Ralston Creek Road, effective immediately upon receipt of this notice, as the deed of record had been transferred to the possession of one Mr. Cornelius Draper of San Antonio, by authority of unpaid taxes and a lien held against the late Earl Ralston, her father, who had died just 8 weeks prior. 8 weeks. Her father had been in the ground 8 weeks, and already the land he had broken his back for, land he had watered with his own sweat and tears, and in the end with his own blood, was being taken from beneath her feet. Lucy folded the paper with trembling hands and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, and she turned and looked out at the 240 acres her father had built from nothing in the year 1871, when he had come to this part of Texas with nothing but a mule, a plow, a few dollars, and a dream big enough to fill the whole horizon. That had been 17 years ago. Lucy had been 6 years old. She had grown up on this land, learned to read by lamplight in the kitchen, learned to ride in the east pasture, buried her mother beside the old oak tree when she was 12 years old, and buried her father 8 weeks ago under the same sky, under the same relentless Texas sun. She was 23 years old, and everything she had ever known was being stripped from her in a piece of paper smaller than her 2 hands. She went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table. She pressed her palms flat against the wood her father had planed smooth himself, and she let herself cry for exactly 5 minutes, because that was all she could afford. Then she stood up, wiped her face on her apron, and began to think. The taxes. She had known about the taxes. Her father had mentioned them in the last weeks of his illness, mentioned them with the helpless shame of a man who had always paid his own way and now found himself falling short. There had been a drought the summer before, a real killing drought that had cracked the earth and shriveled the crops, and the cattle had gone lean, and the money had dried up right along with the creek. Earl Ralston had borrowed against the land, borrowed from a man named Cornelius Draper, who was known in these parts as a man who loaned money the way a spider spun a web generously and only to catch things. Lucy had not known the debt had grown so large. She had not known that a lien had been filed. She had assumed with the optimism of grief that she would have time to sort it all out once she was through the worst of the mourning. She had assumed wrong. 3 days. She had 3 days. The first thing she did was saddle her bay mare, Clementine, and ride the 4 miles into Dust Creek to see Judge Harding, who was not exactly a friend but was a fair man, or at least a man who had been known to be fair when it suited him. She found him in his office above the dry goods store, a narrow, dusty room that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper, and she told him everything in a clear, steady voice that she was very proud of, given the circumstances. Judge Harding listened with his fingers steepled together and his eyebrows raised in the general direction of sympathy, and then he told her that there was nothing he could do. The lien was legitimate. The debt was real. The transfer of deed had been properly filed with the county. She could challenge it in court, he said, but a challenge would take months and she would need a lawyer, and lawyers cost money she clearly did not have. And in the meantime the notice stood and the 3-day clock was already ticking. She thanked him without any particular warmth, went back down the narrow stairs, and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the afternoon heat, squinting at the dusty street, thinking. Dust Creek was not a large town. It had a main street with the usual establishments: the dry goods store, the saloon, the livery stable, the telegraph office, the barber, the small white church at the far end of the street where Reverend Cobb preached on Sundays with the conviction of a man who had seen the face of the Almighty and found it distinctly Presbyterian. There was a hotel, the Dust Creek Arms, which was a grand name for a building that had 4 rooms and a roof that leaked when it rained. And there was a small land office that was currently, Lucy thought with some bitterness, the source of all her troubles. She considered her options as she stood there in the afternoon heat with Clementine's reins in her hand. She could ride to Abilene. There were lawyers in Abilene, and some of them were said to be decent men. But the ride was 2 days each way, and she only had 3 days total, and she had no money to pay a lawyer anyway. She could appeal to the mercy of Cornelius Draper directly. This option made her stomach turn. She had met Draper exactly once, at a cattle auction 2 years prior, and the memory of him, the oiled hair, the flat brown eyes that appraised everything they looked at as if calculating its resale value, the way he had looked at her with something that was not quite admiration and not quite contempt, but contained elements of both, was not encouraging. She could try to raise the money, but the tax debt, according to the notice, was $432, a sum so large it might as well have been $4,000, given what she had available to her, which was $37 and some change in a tin box under the floorboard of the kitchen. She was standing there in the middle of all this hopeless arithmetic when she heard someone say her name. Lucy Ralston. It was not a question. It was said with a kind of careful steadiness, the way a man says something when he is not entirely sure of his welcome, but has decided to proceed anyway. She turned, and the afternoon sun was behind the speaker, which meant she had to shade her eyes to see him clearly, and for a moment all she could make out was the silhouette of a tall man in a well-worn hat, broad-shouldered, standing with his weight on one leg in the particular unhurried way of a man who had spent a great deal of his life outdoors. Then he stepped forward out of the direct glare, and she saw his face. Amos Warren. She had not seen Amos Warren in 2 years, which was how long he had been gone, and in those 2 years she had thought about him with the particular conflicted feeling of a woman who has told herself very firmly that she is not thinking about someone, and thereby thinks about them constantly. He had been her father's hired hand for 3 years before that, had come to the Ralston place in the summer of 1882 when he was 25 years old, lean and brown from the trail, with quiet gray eyes, and a manner so unassuming that it had taken her a full month to realize how much she had come to rely on the particular calm of his presence. He had worked hard, harder than was strictly necessary, and he had been good to her father in the old man's declining years, and he and Lucy had reached a kind of friendship that was always in danger of becoming something else and never quite did, because neither of them had been willing to be the one who crossed that particular line first. Then, 2 years ago, he had left. He had not said exactly where he was going, only that he had some business to attend to up north, and he had shaken Earl Ralston's hand and tipped his hat at Lucy with a look that she had spent a considerable amount of time afterward trying to interpret. And then he had ridden north on his black horse, and she had told herself, very firmly, that this was fine, that she was perfectly fine. And she had gone on being perfectly fine in the determined and slightly hollow way of someone who is working hard at it. And now here he was, on the wooden sidewalk in Dusk Creek, 2 years older, looking at her with those quiet gray eyes that gave away very little but always somehow managed to give away the important things, and she was standing there with a piece of paper in her apron pocket that told her she had 3 days before she lost everything. "Amos," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. She had always been better at steadiness than she gave herself credit for. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm sorry, Lucy, he was a good man." "He was," she said. They stood there for a moment in the way of 2 people who have a great deal to say to each other and are not yet certain where to begin. A wagon rolled past in the street, raising a small cloud of brown dust. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something that apparently deserved it. "What are you doing in Dusk Creek?" she asked, because it seemed like the practical question. "I came back," he said, and the simplicity of it was so complete that she almost laughed. "I can see that." "Where did you come back from?" "Montana, mostly. Did some work up there on a cattle ranch, saved some money." He paused. "I was heading back this way. Thought I might see if the Ralston place had need of a hand." "It might not be the Ralston place much longer," she said, and she told him about the notice, quietly and efficiently, standing there on the sidewalk while the afternoon light shifted toward gold. She was not sure why she told him. Perhaps because he had always been someone she could talk to without the performance of it, without the careful management of how things looked or what was appropriate. He had always just listened, and that had always been enough. He listened now. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she watched him think. She had always been able to tell when he was thinking, because a small vertical line appeared between his eyebrows, and he would look at a point somewhere in the middle distance as if the answer to whatever question he was wrestling with might be written there in letters just too small to read without concentration. $432, he said. "Yes. And 2 days left now. 2 full days after today," she said. "Today is essentially gone," he nodded slowly. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Not here. Can we ride back to the property?" "I don't see why not," she said. "I still own it until the day after tomorrow, technically." The smallest ghost of a smile crossed his face. "You always did have a gift for looking at things practically." "Someone has too," she said. They rode back to the homestead side by side, she on Clementine and he on the black horse that she recognized with a small jolt of something she couldn't name. It was the same horse he had ridden away on 2 years ago, still strong and glossy, still carrying Amos Warren's particular quiet authority as if it had been bred for exactly that purpose. The ride took about 40 minutes in the late afternoon light, and they talked about small things, the state of the range, the weather, whether the creek had recovered any from the drought the summer before, in the way of two people who are comfortable with each other, and are not yet ready to begin the harder conversation. The homestead looked beautiful in the evening light, which was something Lucy had learned about grief and loss. The things you are about to lose always look their most beautiful just as you are losing them. The farmhouse was not large, 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, built of rough-hewn limestone that had weathered to the color of old bone. There was a vegetable garden behind it, and a small orchard of peach trees her father had planted the year she was born, and a barn that listed slightly to one side but had stood through 2 decades of Texas weather, and showed no particular signs of imminent collapse. The east pasture stretched away toward a line of cottonwood trees that followed the creek, and in the long evening light the grass was the color of copper, and everything was very still and very beautiful, and Lucy looked at it with the fierce concentrated attention of someone committing something to memory. She put Clementine in the barn and saw that Amos put his black horse in there too, and she went into the kitchen and built up the fire and put the coffee pot on, because that was what you did, regardless of circumstances. You kept the fire going and you put the coffee on. Amos sat down at the kitchen table, the table where she had sat that morning and cried her 5 minutes' worth of tears, and he set his hat on the edge of the table and ran a hand through his dark hair, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that were, she decided, the most careful eyes she had ever looked into. Not cold, never cold, just careful. As if whatever was behind them was being kept with a great deal of deliberate attention. "I have $480, he said. She turned from the stove to look at him. "What?" "I have $480 in savings from the Montana work. I put it in the bank in Abilene before I rode down here." He paused. "It's enough to cover the tax debt and the lien. We'd have $48 left over." She stared at him. The coffee pot began to make its preliminary sounds, small hisses and complaints as the water heated. "Amos," she said carefully, "you can't just give me your savings." "I'm not proposing to give it to you," he said, and there was something in his voice that had changed slightly, a new quality of deliberateness that made her pay close attention. "I'm proposing something else." She turned all the way around from the stove and looked at him fully. "Say what you mean," she said. He reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and put something on the table between them. It was a ring, small, simple, a band of gold with a single small stone in it, turquoise blue, the color of the sky on a clear morning. It sat there on the worn wood of the kitchen table like something that had been waiting a very long time to be put down in exactly this place. "I bought that in Santa Fe," he said, "about 18 months ago." Lucy looked at the ring. She looked at Amos. She looked at the ring again. The coffee pot began to boil. 18 months ago," she repeated. "I have been meaning to come back for some time," he said, and his voice was very steady, but there was something underneath it, something that was not quite steady, and she found that she appreciated the effort more than she could easily say. "What I am proposing, Lucy, is this. Let me pay the tax debt and clear the lien. Let this land stay in the Ralston name, or rather, let it become the Warren name as well. I want to work this land with you. I want to build something with you. I have for a long time." He paused. "Marry me. That is what I'm asking. I know the timing is not what either of us would have chosen, and I know you have every reason to tell me to take my ring and ride back to wherever I came from. And if that is what you want, I will pay the debt anyway, because your father was good to me and this land deserves to stay with the people who love it. But I am hoping that is not what you say." There was a long silence. The coffee pot boiled vigorously. A whippoorwill called once from somewhere outside, in the gathering dusk. Lucy turned off the fire under the coffee pot, not because she had decided anything, but because the physical act of doing something gave her hands something to occupy themselves while her mind did its work. She thought about the 2 years he had been gone. She thought about the feeling she had carried with her through those 2 years, which she had called, for the sake of her own dignity, mild regret, but which, in her more honest moments, she had known was something considerably larger than that. She thought about the ring sitting on the table, which he had bought in Santa Fe 18 months ago, which meant that he had been carrying the intention of this question for 18 months, which was, by any reasonable measure, a long time to carry something. She thought about the notice in her apron pocket. She thought about her father's land in the evening light, the copper grass and the cottonwood trees and the peach orchard. She thought about Amos Warren sitting across the kitchen table with his hat on the edge of the wood, and his careful gray eyes watching her with an expression that was doing its level best to be neutral, but was not entirely succeeding. "Tell me something," she said. "The money, you would pay it regardless, you said. That means this," she gestured at the ring, "is not a transaction. You are not buying me with it." "No," he said, with a quiet definiteness that she believed immediately. "The land question and the question of you are separate questions, and I want you to hear that clearly. I will ride to Abilene tomorrow morning and wire the money to cover the debt whether you say yes to that ring or not, because it is the right thing to do, and because your father deserved better than to have his life's work taken by a man like Cornelius Draper. The ring is a different matter entirely. The ring is because I have been in love with you since approximately the fall of 1883, when you argued with a cattle buyer from Dallas for 45 straight minutes and won." Despite everything, she laughed. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, and it felt like something loosening in her chest that had been pulled very tight for a very long time. She poured the coffee. She set a cup in front of him and kept one for herself and sat down across from him at the table, and she looked at the ring and she looked at him. "Amos," she said, "I am going to need a little time." "You have until tomorrow morning," he said simply. "I ride to Abilene at first light regardless. I just need to know, before I go, whether I am riding back to a wife or to a friend." "Those are your only 2 options," she said. "Those are the only 2 I'm willing to consider," he said. They drank their coffee in the kitchen as the light faded fully and the stars came out over the Texas plain, thick and bright in the way that stars are only in places far enough from other lights that the sky can show its full capacity. They talked. Not about the proposal, not yet, but about everything else. About the 3 years he had worked on the place, about his father, who had been a farmer in Ohio and had never quite forgiven Amos for going west, about her mother, who had been a teacher and had taught Lucy to read and to think carefully and to say what she meant. About Montana, about the high cold air up there and the different quality of the light. About the drought and the cattle and the state of the range, and whether the creek was going to recover. It was ordinary talk, kitchen talk, the kind of talk that two people share when they are comfortable with each other. And in the middle of it Lucy became aware, gradually and then all at once, of how much she had missed it. Not the talk itself, but the specific quality of it, the ease of it, the way she did not have to explain herself to Amos Warren or choose her words with particular care, because he had always simply understood what she meant. She had missed him. She had missed him every single day for 2 years, and she had been very busy not admitting this to herself, and sitting across the kitchen table from him in the lamplight with her father's land outside the window and 3 days running to zero and a ring sitting on the table between them, she decided that she was tired of not admitting things. Yes, she said. He had been in the middle of saying something about the creek and he stopped. He looked at her. The lamplight was warm on his face and he looked, she thought, like a man who was trying very hard not to allow himself to believe something until he was entirely certain he had heard it correctly. Yes, she said again, and this time she picked up the ring from the table and held it out to him. Yes, Amos, ask me properly. Something shifted in his face, something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time. He stood up from the table and he came around to her side, and he went down on one knee on the worn kitchen floor, and he took the ring from her hand and looked up at her, and his gray eyes were not carefully neutral anymore, not at all. Lucy Ralston, he said. Will you marry me? Yes, she said for the 3rd time, because some things deserve to be said 3 times. Yes, I will. He put the ring on her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her, which it had not, or perhaps it had, in the way that some things are made for people before anyone knows it. He stood up, and they were very close together, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her. And then he kissed her, quietly and deliberately, the way he did everything, and it was the first time they had kissed, and it felt entirely like something that had been waiting to happen for years, which it had, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. Outside, the Texas night was enormous and dark and full of stars, and the creek talked to itself in the middle distance, and the peach trees stood in the dark orchard, and the land lay still and waiting. The next morning came up bright and sharp, the kind of clear blue Texas morning that makes it hard to believe anything could go wrong, the sky so pure and cloudless that it seemed almost like a promise. Lucy was already up when Amos came downstairs, had already made coffee and was frying eggs in the iron skillet, and he paused in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at her for a moment before she noticed him, and his expression then was one that she would remember for a very long time, quiet and certain and deeply pleased, the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he has been trying to get to for a long time and finds it exactly as good as he had hoped. You are going to Abilene, she said, without turning around from the stove. I am, he said. I'll ride fast. I can make it there by midday if I push, wire the money to the county land office and be back before dark tomorrow. That is the last day, she said. The deadline is tomorrow at sundown. I know, he said. I will make it. She put the eggs on the table and they sat down and ate together in the morning light, and it was domestic and ordinary, and also, underneath that, something entirely extraordinary, and both of them knew it. Before he left, she told him about something she had been thinking about through the night, in the hours between their conversation and the few hours of sleep she had managed. There's a problem, she said. Even if you pay the debt, Draper already has the deed. He has it legally, on paper. Paying the tax money doesn't automatically get the deed back. We need to be sure the legal process is handled correctly. Amos was already thinking about this. I know a man in Abilene, he said. A lawyer named Garrett. He is a good man and an honest one, which in my experience is not always the same thing. I will find him and have him draw up the proper paperwork. If we pay the debt in full with the proper documentation and the right witnesses, Draper has no legal leg to stand on. The lien is the only thing giving him claim to the deed, and once the lien is satisfied, the deed reverts. But you're right that it has to be done correctly. It does, she said. Draper is not a man who will release anything without being compelled to. No, Amos agreed. He is not. There was something else she had been thinking about. He may try to resist it, she said. He may try to delay. He may claim the money arrived after the deadline or that there were additional fees or any number of things that such a man would claim. Then we will need a witness who cannot be dismissed, Amos said. Someone whose word carries weight in this county. Judge Harding, she said. He told me yesterday there was nothing he could do, but that was without a solution. If you come back with the money and the legal paperwork, he cannot refuse to certify the transaction. His dignity would not allow him to be seen as the man who helped Cornelius Draper steal a widow's farm. She paused. A dead man's daughter's farm, she corrected. A young woman alone. You are not alone, Amos said quietly. She looked at him across the table in the morning light with the ring on her finger that she kept noticing, kept looking down at, a habit so new it still surprised her each time. No, she said, I am not. He rode out before 7 in the morning, the black horse moving at a canter down the creek road, and Lucy stood on the porch and watched him go until the dust settled. And then she turned and looked at the land around her and thought about what needed to be done. There was a great deal. The problem of Cornelius Draper was not limited to the legal paperwork. Draper had an agent in Dust Creek, a man named Harker, who had been the one to deliver the notice, and Harker had mentioned, with the particular oiliness of a man relaying someone else's power, that Mr. Draper intended to take possession of the property personally on the 3rd day. That meant Draper himself might appear before the deadline, and if he appeared before Amos returned with the money and the documentation, there could be trouble. Lucy was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was a woman who thought carefully, and she thought carefully now about how to manage the next 2 days. She decided, first, that she was not going to stay alone on the property. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because, practically speaking, a single woman alone on a contested property was vulnerable in ways that were legal as much as physical. She needed a witness of her own, someone who could attest to her presence on the land and to any interactions that might occur. She rode into Dust Creek and found Reverend Cobb at the church, sweeping the front steps with the industrious air of a man who believed that cleanliness and godliness were in fact the same thing. She told him, without quite all of the details, that she needed him to come and stay at the homestead for the next day, as she was expecting some difficult visitors and would appreciate the presence of a man of standing. Reverend Cobb, who had known Lucy since she was 6 years old and had presided over the funerals of both her parents, agreed without a great deal of argument. He had a quality of practical Christianity that Lucy had always respected, the kind that put itself to use rather than merely invoking itself from a comfortable distance. She also stopped at the dry goods store and spoke with Mrs. Hennessy, who ran the store along with her husband and was the most effective news distribution system in Dust Creek, more reliable than the telegraph by virtue of being faster and more interested. Lucy did not say anything directly, but she mentioned, in a tone of calm informational exchange, that she had had some help with her situation and expected it to be resolved within the next 2 days, and that she wanted Cornelius Draper's agent Harker to know, if he happened to come by, that the property matter was in hand. Mrs. Hennessy nodded with the satisfied expression of someone who has been given exactly the kind of information she most likes to have, and Lucy left the store knowing that within the hour, Harker would know that the Ralston woman was not going quietly, and with any luck, Draper himself would know it before evening. She spent the rest of the day doing what she had been doing for 8 weeks, which was managing the property by herself, feeding the animals, mending a section of fence in the south pasture that had been listing since the last windstorm, checking on the vegetable garden, walking the creek to see its level. The orchard needed tending, the peach trees showing the small green hard knobs of fruit that would ripen in another month or so, and she moved through the trees in the afternoon heat and tried to imagine this place in a year, 2 years, 5 years, with Amos working alongside her, the two of them building the thing her father had always meant for it to become. She could imagine it. That was the thing she kept coming back to, through all the practical worry and the exhaustion. She could imagine it very clearly. Reverend Cobb arrived at the homestead in the early evening, driving his battered wagon and bringing with him a covered dish that turned out to contain a very good chicken pie, which Lucy had not expected and was grateful for. He asked no questions beyond what was strictly necessary, ate his supper with gratitude, and took himself off to bed in the loft with the ease of a man who was accustomed to making himself useful in difficult circumstances, without complicating them unnecessarily. Lucy sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, alone for the first time since morning, and she let herself be still. She looked at the ring on her finger, turquoise blue, the color of the sky. He had bought it in Santa Fe 18 months ago. She thought about what that meant, not the sentiment of it, though the sentiment moved her considerably, but the practical reality of it. He had gone away, and he had kept coming back in his mind, had carried the intention of returning as something concrete enough to buy a ring for, had worked and saved and then ridden south, not knowing what had happened to the Ralston place or to her, not knowing that her father was dead or that the land was about to be taken, just riding south because he had meant to, because there was something here he was not willing to leave permanently behind. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the Texas night, the creek, the insects, the occasional far sound of coyotes on the plain, and she thought about the word yes, about how small it was and how much it contained, and she fell asleep with the ring on her finger and woke to a second morning that was every bit as blue and bright as the one before it. The third day's morning was hours away still. She had today and until sundown tomorrow. She had today and the faith that Amos Warren was riding hard toward Abilene and back with everything they needed, and the faith was not blind, not exactly. It was grounded in what she knew of him, in 3 years of watching him do what he said he would do, without exception, without drama, without requiring thanks for it. She was halfway through feeding the horses when she heard the wagon. She came out of the barn and shaded her eyes, and the wagon coming down the creek road was not Amos's horse, and it was not the Reverend's battered conveyance. It was a hired buggy, polished and dark, drawn by a matched pair of bays, the kind of transportation that announced money and the importance of the person spending it. Cornelius Draper was not waiting for the third day. He was here now on the second day in the bright morning, and he was not alone. There was a man beside him on the buggy seat who had the general build and expression of a man, employed specifically for situations in which size was the primary argument, and there was another man on horseback following behind the buggy, and Lucy recognized the second man as Harker, Draper's agent. She put down the feed bucket, and she waited. Draper climbed down from the buggy with the careful movements of a man who was heavy enough to have to think about dismounting from things. He was perhaps 50, with the broad, well-fed look of someone who had spent the last decade sitting at a desk watching money accumulate, and he wore a good suit that was impractical for this setting and seemed to know it. He had pale eyes that appraised things, and he looked at Lucy with them now, and she met his gaze with the most level and unimpressed expression she could manage, which was quite level and quite unimpressed. "Miss Ralston," he said, and his voice had the smooth quality of a man accustomed to conversations he intended to win. "I hope I find you well. I apologize for the early call. I find it's best to handle these matters without letting them drag on." "You have arrived a day early," she said. "The notice gives me until sundown tomorrow." "Indeed it does," he said, and his tone acknowledged this without conceding anything. "However, I find myself in Dusk Creek on business, and I thought, since we are both practical people, we might come to a friendly understanding. I am prepared to be generous with the matter of your personal effects. You may take whatever time you need to remove them. I simply want to establish that we are all clear on the situation." "We are clear on the situation," Lucy said. "I have until tomorrow at sundown. I am on this property until that deadline. I have no intention of leaving before it." Draper's pale eyes moved over the property, the house, the barn, the pasture, the orchard with the look of a man taking inventory, and it made her want to step directly into his line of sight, to block his view of her father's land. "You are a young woman without a great deal of resources," he said, with the particular gentleness that people deploy when they want to make cruelty sound like concern. "I understand this is your family's home, and I have a great deal of sympathy for that. But the debt is real, Miss Ralston, and the legal process has run its course. Fighting it will only cost you time and what little money you have. I am not interested in your sympathy," she said clearly. "And I am not interested in having this conversation. You will have your answer before the deadline tomorrow. Until then, I ask you to leave this property." Reverend Cobb had appeared on the porch during the conversation, a lean man in his 60s with the sun-browned face of someone who had spent decades in Texas, and his very presence had the mild but unmistakable effect of a witness, someone whose account of events would be believed and repeated, and Draper glanced at him and understood this. "I see you are well attended," Draper said. His tone had not changed, but something in it had recalculated. "Very well, Miss Ralston. I will take my leave. I expect we will speak again tomorrow." He paused, and then he added, with the particular quality of a man making a final offer before walking away, "If you find yourself in need of a practical arrangement, I am a man of business. I know of situations in which a property manager might be required, or," he let the pause hang, "other arrangements. I am a widower, Miss Ralston, and I am not without means." The sheer audacity of it was so enormous that it actually helped her. The anger it produced was clean and clarifying, and it settled something in her that had been anxious, replaced it with something firm and certain. "No," she said. "Good morning, Mr. Draper." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she did not look away, and then he turned and went back to his buggy and his large hired man and Harker, and the dark buggy moved back down the creek road, and the dust settled behind it, and he was gone. Reverend Cobb came down off the porch. "That was well done," he said simply. "He'll be back tomorrow," she said. "Most likely," Cobb agreed. "Is the help you mentioned coming?" "Yes," she said, and she believed it fully, which was the thing about Amos Warren. He had always been the kind of man you believed fully, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it. "He is coming." That second day stretched long. Lucy worked through it steadily, keeping her hands busy with the endless tasks of the property, and Reverend Cobb helped where he could and stayed out of the way where he could not. And the afternoon light moved in its long arc across the Texas sky, and the shadows stretched out to the east, and evening came, and Amos had not come. She told herself this was fine. Abilene was a long ride, and he had business to conduct there, and the return trip was equally long, and there were any number of things that could slow a man without preventing him. She told herself this while she made supper and while she ate it, and while she cleaned up and while she sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight trying to read the Bible her mother had left her, which was the only book in the house, and not managing to read it with any particular comprehension. At 8:30 in the evening, she heard a horse on the creek road. She was on the porch before the sound resolved itself into a rider she could see, and the rider was Amos Warren on his black horse, moving at a canter, and the relief that went through her was physical, a loosening in every muscle, and she stood on the porch with her hand on the post and watched him ride up. He looked tired. He had been in the saddle for the better part of 2 days with very little rest between, and he had the drawn, dusty look of a man who has pushed himself hard and not complained about it. But he was also, she could see it even in the lamplight falling through the door, satisfied, in the particular deep way of a man who has done the thing he set out to do. He swung down from the horse and tied it at the post and came up on the porch, and he took a folded packet of papers from inside his coat and held it out to her. "Garrett did it," he said. "He worked all afternoon and through part of the evening to get it done. The lien satisfaction document, the tax payment receipt stamped by the Caldwell County Land Office in Abilene. They have a deputy office there, and a writ requiring the original deed to be returned upon presentation of the satisfaction documents. Signed and witnessed properly." He paused to take a breath. "I also sent a telegram to the county commissioner's office in San Antonio, informing them that the debt is paid and that any further action to dispossess the owner of the property would be subject to legal challenge." Lucy looked at the papers in her hands. She could feel the solidity of them, the official weight of them, the way the right papers in the right form had a specific gravity to them that was entirely different from the paper of the notice that had started all of this. "Draper came today," she said. "A day early." Amos's expression sharpened. "What happened?" she told him briefly, and his jaw tightened slightly at the part about Draper's offer, but he said nothing about that, only, "He will come tomorrow, then. With the papers, he cannot do anything." "But he may try." "He may try," she agreed. "He does not seem like a man who accepts results he didn't choose." "No," Amos said, "which is why Garrett is coming himself. He will be here by mid-morning. He has dealt with men like Draper before and knows exactly what to say and how to say it to make the legal reality absolutely clear." She looked at him. "You brought the lawyer." "I thought it might be useful," he said, with the mild understatement that she had come to recognize as one of his most characteristic qualities. "It will be very useful," she said. "Come inside. You need to eat and sleep." "In that order," he agreed, and there was a warmth in his voice, a quiet ease that was different from 2 days ago, or not different, but more present, as if he had allowed himself to carry it more openly now that the question had been answered. Reverend Cobb emerged from the loft to eat supper with them, the last of the chicken pie, supplemented with bread and beans, and the three of them sat at the table in the lamplight, and Amos and the Reverend shook hands with the mutual respect of men who did not know each other but could assess each other fairly quickly. And there was something in the warmth of the kitchen, in the shared meal and the smell of coffee and the sound of the Texas night outside, that felt like something beginning. She watched Amos across the table, the tired, satisfied lines of his face, the way he listened to Reverend Cobb with genuine interest, the way his hand rested near hers on the table, not touching but near, and she thought that this was what she had been missing in all the hard months since her father's death. Not just another person in the house, though that was part of it, but this specific person, this specific quality of presence. After supper, the Reverend returned to the loft, and Amos took the narrow settle in the main room, and Lucy went to bed in her father's old room, which she had moved into after his death because the smaller room that had been hers seemed, without the sense of him nearby, too lonely to bear. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, the familiar sounds of it, the creak of the roof, the sound of the wind in the eaves, the far-off creek, and she thought about tomorrow, which was the third day, which was the day everything would be decided one way or another. She slept and woke, and the third day came. The morning was cloudless, the same impeccable blue that the Texas sky produced in late spring, as if to demonstrate what blue actually looked like without any confusion about it. Lucy was up before the sun had cleared the horizon, and she made coffee and fed the animals and was back in the kitchen, when Amos came down from the settle looking better for the sleep, the exhaustion of the ride smoothed out of his face, his gray eyes clear. They drank their coffee on the porch together, watching the morning come up full and bright over the east pasture, and it was very quiet and very still, and the peach trees were small green shapes in the morning light. "Whatever happens today," Lucy said, "I want you to know something." "What's that?" he said. "The yes from 2 nights ago, it wasn't because of the money. I want to be certain you know that." He turned to look at her. "I know that," he said. "I want to say it plainly anyway," she said, "because things are about to get complicated today and I may not have a quiet moment to say it, and I want you to have heard it in a quiet moment. It was never the money, it was you. It has been you for a long time." He was quiet for a moment, and then he set down his coffee cup on the porch rail and turned to face her more fully, and his expression was the one she had seen in the kitchen 2 nights ago, careful, certain, deeply and uncomplicatedly glad. "It has been you for a long time too," he said, "if we're being plain about it." "We are," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size of his hands, and she leaned into it slightly, and they stood together on the porch in the morning light with the third day beginning around them, and it was good. Whatever came next, it was good. Garrett the lawyer arrived from Abilene at 10:30 in the morning, which was impressive given the distance, and indicated that he had set out very early indeed. He was a compact, brisk man in his 50s, with a neat gray beard and the quick, precise eyes of someone who lived in the details of things and found them genuinely interesting. He shook hands with Lucy and said, without preliminary, that he had handled matters like this before and that the documents were airtight, and she believed him without reservation, because he said it with the specific confidence of a man who knew exactly what airtight meant. Draper arrived at 2 in the afternoon. He came with the same dark buggy and the same large hired man and Harker, and this time he had also brought along a man whom Lucy recognized as Baines, the notary from the county land office in Dust Creek, which told her that Draper had done his own preparation and intended to make the transfer of deed official today, in front of witnesses, with proper documentation. The yard in front of the homestead was not exactly crowded, but it had more people in it than Lucy had seen there since her father's funeral. Draper and his 3 men, Amos and Garrett, Reverend Cobb, Lucy herself. Draper looked at the assembled group with the expression of a man who had expected a simpler situation, and Lucy saw the quick calculation happen behind his pale eyes. "Miss Ralston," he said, "I see you have visitors." "I see you have brought company as well," she said. Garrett stepped forward then, and something about the way he stepped forward, with the compact, unhurried certainty of a man who has spent decades in courtrooms and knows that the quality of a step can set a tone, made Draper's eyes move sharply to him. "My name is Thomas Garrett, attorney at law, Abilene," Garrett said. "Mr. Draper, I represent Miss Ralston in this matter. I have here the documentation to satisfy the lien on this property in full." He reached into his briefcase and produced the packet of papers, which he handed to Baines the notary with a look that was perfectly pleasant and utterly steel-spined. "You'll find a certified payment receipt from the Caldwell County Land Office, the lien satisfaction document executed and witnessed yesterday afternoon in Abilene, and a writ from Judge Harding of Dust Creek directing the return of the deed to the property upon satisfaction of the lien." He paused. "The debt is paid in full. The legal basis for the deed transfer no longer exists. The deed reverts to the Ralston family by operation of law." Baines the notary was already reading the documents with the concentrated attention of a man who understood their implications and was being very careful. He read through them twice slowly, and then he looked up at Draper with an expression that was apologetic but also unmistakably final. "These appear to be in order," Baines said. Draper's pale eyes had not changed. He turned them to Garrett and then to Amos and then back to Lucy. "This is highly irregular," he said, and his voice was still smooth, but there was something underneath it now, a tightness. "The transfer of deed was completed legally. The payment comes after the fact." "The payment comes within the legally specified period," Garrett said. "The notice gave 3 days. Today is the 3rd day and we are 4 hours from the deadline. The documentation is properly executed. The debt is satisfied. I have also sent notice to the county commissioner in San Antonio and to the district land office, both of which have copies of these documents. Mr. Draper, the matter is concluded." There was a silence that stretched across the yard, and Lucy watched it happen, watched Draper weigh his options with those flat, calculating eyes, watched him measure the assembled witnesses, the legal documentation, the finality of Baines's expression, and watched him arrive at the conclusion that any man of sense arrives at when the case is genuinely closed, that the cost of continuing was greater than anything he could gain from it. He was not happy about it. That was clear. But Cornelius Draper was, above all other things, a practical man, and practical men know when a game is done. "Very well," he said, and the smoothness was back in place, the professional composure of a man who had lost this particular round but had every intention of winning the next one somewhere else. He looked at Lucy. "Miss Ralston, I hope the property serves you well." There was no warmth in it, no genuine wish. It was the form of civility without the content, but the form was enough. He turned and got back into his dark buggy, and Harker and the large hired man followed, and the buggy moved out of the yard and down the creek road, and the dust rose behind it and then settled, and it was gone. The yard was quiet for a moment, and then Reverend Cobb said, "Well," in the tone of a man who found the situation entirely satisfying, and Garrett began returning papers to his briefcase with the brisk efficiency of a man whose work was done, and Baines the notary offered Lucy his congratulations with what seemed like genuine relief, and Amos Warren stood in the middle of all of it looking at her, and Lucy looked back at him. The relief was enormous. It was not just the land, though the land was a great part of it. It was the culmination of everything that had been pressed down on her since the morning she had stood on the porch and read that notice, the grief and the fear and the exhaustion and the impossible arithmetic of it, and all of it lifting at once was almost dizzying. She stood very still to let it settle. Then she walked to Amos, which was where she had been walking in one way or another for a long time. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together looking at the homestead, the limestone house her father had built, the barn with its slight list, the orchard in the afternoon light, and it was theirs. It was going to be theirs. Garrett stayed for a cup of coffee before starting back for Abilene, and he and Amos shook hands at some length, and Garrett gave Lucy a professional assessment of what she would need to do over the next few weeks to ensure all the documentation was properly filed and registered, which she noted carefully, and then he climbed on his horse and rode east, and she was grateful to him, in the specific and lasting way that people are grateful to those who help them in moments of genuine need. Reverend Cobb stayed for supper, which Lucy cooked with a lightness of spirit that produced, she thought, the best meal she had made in months, salt pork and cornbread and the last of the stored sweet potatoes, and it was simple food but good, and they ate it at the table where she had cried, and where Amos had put the ring down 2 days ago, and the table seemed to her to contain the whole arc of it. After supper, when the Reverend was settling himself for what would prove to be his last night in the loft, he would ride back to Dusk Creek in the morning. Lucy and Amos sat on the porch in the last light of the third day, watching the sun go down in a long, slow blaze of orange and red over the western plain. "It's over," she said. "This part of it," he said. "The next part is just beginning." "I like the sound of that," she said. He turned to her, and in the evening light his face was warm and the gray of his eyes had taken on something of the gold of the sunset, and he said quietly, "I would like to be married properly, not just the arrangement of it. I want it done right." "So do I," she said. "What does right look like to you?" "Reverend Cobb," he said, "the church in Dusk Creek, you in a decent dress and me in my good shirt, and whatever people you would like to have there." "That is exactly right," she said. "When?" "As soon as we can manage it decently," he said. "I do not want to wait a long time." "Neither do I," she said. "Next month." "Give me a month to get the dress sorted and to write to Aunt Clara in Galveston, who is the only family I have left and will be quite put out if she is not there." "Next month, then," he said, and he sounded very pleased. She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was very solid and very warm, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the last of the sunset dissolve into the dark blue of the Texas evening, and the stars came out one by one, and the creek talked in the distance, and the peach trees were dark shapes in the orchard, and the land settled around them into the quiet of night. The month before the wedding was the fullest month Lucy could remember in a long time. There was the practical work of the farm, which continued regardless of anything else, and there was Amos now doing it alongside her, which changed it entirely. Not just the workload, though that was real enough, but the quality of each day. The way a task done with someone you care for is a different kind of task altogether. They fell into a routine that seemed to have been waiting for them, rather than something they had to construct from scratch. She managed the house and the garden and the chickens and the financial ledger she had taken over from her father, and he managed the animals and the fencing and the heavier work of the fields, and they spent the middle parts of each day overlapping, helping each other with whatever needed two pairs of hands, and the evenings on the porch or at the kitchen table, talking with the ease of people who have discovered that conversation with each other is a pleasure rather than an obligation. He was funny, which she had always known but which she had not fully appreciated in the years when their situation had kept a certain careful distance in place. Not loudly funny, not the broad, announced humor of a man who wants everyone to know he has said something clever, but the dry, observational kind, the kind that appeared when she least expected it and required her to pay attention not to miss it. And she found that she liked catching it, liked the small moment of shared recognition that passed between them when she did. She also discovered, in those weeks of ordinary days, things about him that the years of being careful with each other had not given her occasion to know. He read, which surprised her. He had brought 3 books in his saddlebag, a battered copy of Dickens and a volume of history and something in Spanish that he was working through slowly, having picked up the language during a year he had spent in New Mexico before Montana. He could play the harmonica, not with great skill but with genuine feeling, and sometimes in the evenings she would hear it from the porch while she was inside, a quiet tune drifting in through the window that she would stop and listen to before she remembered to go back to whatever she had been doing. He also had opinions about things, considered and clear ones, which he expressed without the performance of certainty that she had encountered in men who mistook volume for substance. He thought carefully before he said things, and when he said them, he meant them, and she found this more attractive than she could easily articulate, which meant it was deeply attractive. She caught herself watching him. This was new or not new, but newly permitted, newly unguarded, and she allowed herself the pleasure of it without the old reflexive pulling back. She watched him work and watched him eat and watched him talk to Reverend Cobb at the church when they rode in on Sundays, and she felt the particular happiness of someone who has been given permission, at last, to look directly at the thing they love. Aunt Clara arrived from Galveston on the 3rd Saturday of the month, on the stage that came through Dusk Creek every Tuesday and Friday, which meant she had waited an extra 3 days in Galveston rather than take a Tuesday stage, because, as she explained to Lucy upon arrival, she preferred not to travel on Tuesdays, a preference whose origin she did not explain and Lucy did not ask about because Aunt Clara's preferences were simply one of the facts of the universe, like gravity. Aunt Clara was her mother's sister, 60 years old and built like someone who had decided early in life that the world was going to have to accommodate itself to her rather than the other way around. She had brown eyes that missed nothing, hands that were always doing something, and an opinion about everything, delivered with the directness of a woman who had reached the age where sugarcoating required more energy than it was worth. She looked at Amos for approximately 4 seconds upon meeting him, shook his hand with a grip that clearly startled him, and then turned to Lucy and said, in a tone that was simultaneously an approval and a judgment, "Well, at least he looks like he can actually work." "He can," Lucy said. "Good," said Clara. "The last thing you need is a pretty face that can't mend a fence." Amos, to his considerable credit, said nothing and merely looked mildly amused, which was exactly the right response, and Clara's expression shifted by about half a degree toward warmth, which in Clara's lexicon was equivalent to an enthusiastic endorsement. The wedding was on a Saturday, the 2nd day of June, in 1888, in the small white church at the end of Dust Creek's Main Street. Reverend Cobb presided with the gravity and dignity of a man who took the institution seriously, and also, Lucy suspected, with personal satisfaction at having been present for the events that made this particular wedding possible. Lucy wore a dress that Mrs. Hennessy had helped her alter from a length of pale blue cotton lawn, because ivory was impractical and expensive, and the blue matched the ring, which she thought was appropriate. She had done her hair herself, which she did adequately, and Aunt Clara had added a length of lace to the neckline, borrowed from something she had brought from Galveston for exactly this purpose, with the foresight of a woman who is always 3 steps ahead of the situation. The church was not large and it was full. This surprised Lucy, though it probably should not have. Dust Creek was not a large town, and any occasion that offered an alternative to the ordinary Tuesday and Saturday was well attended, and a wedding had the additional appeal of being a thing that people could feel good about. Mrs. Hennessy was there with her husband, and several of the neighboring ranchers who had known Earl Ralston, and Baines the notary, who seemed genuinely glad to be there, and Judge Harding, whose presence had the quality of a man who is attending a story he wants to be able to say he witnessed. Thomas Garrett, the lawyer, had sent a very kind letter of congratulations, which Lucy had read twice, and then placed in the tin box where she kept the ring when she was not wearing it. Amos stood at the front of the church in a white shirt that was his best shirt, and a dark coat that she had not seen before and suspected he had acquired in Abilene on the same trip when he had done everything else, and he looked at her when she came down the aisle with the specific quality of attention that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at her, as if she was the most interesting thing in whatever room they were in together, and he was glad of it. She felt walking toward him down the narrow aisle of the Dust Creek Church, something she had not felt in a very long time, absolutely certain. Not of everything, not of the future or the weather or the price of cattle or any of the 1,000 uncertainties that constituted an actual life, but of this, of him and her, and the direction they were moving together. Reverend Cobb spoke the words of the ceremony, which were old words, worn smooth by repetition into something strong and simple, and Lucy and Amos spoke their vows in the clear, deliberate way of people who are saying what they mean. And when the Reverend asked if anyone knew any reason why this union should not proceed, and the church was silent in the satisfied way of a group of people who do not. Amos slipped the turquoise ring onto her finger, and Lucy thought of him buying it in Santa Fe 18 months ago, carrying it all that way, and she pressed his hand slightly in a way that said what words were not needed to say at that particular moment. Aunt Clara cried, which she would have been indignant about if anyone had mentioned it, so no one did. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the homestead. Reverend Cobb and Mrs. Hennessy and a dozen others, spread across the yard in the June afternoon, eating the food that the women of the community had contributed with the generous collaborative spirit that appeared at these occasions as reliably as the weather, and drinking lemonade and coffee, and among a few of the men, something more fortifying from a brown bottle that Amos had acquired and did not discuss in the Reverend's hearing. The afternoon was long and golden and full of voices, and at some point, she was not sure exactly when, Lucy stopped being aware of the gathering and became aware primarily of Amos beside her, his hand at her back, his voice low and easy in her ear as they moved through the afternoon together. And the day had the quality of something she would keep returning to in memory, not because of any single particular moment, but because of the accumulated warmth of all of it. Aunt Clara left for Galveston 3 days later, with the satisfied expression of a woman who had done what she came to do. At the stage stop, she held Lucy's face in both hands and looked at her for a moment, and then she said, with the characteristic directness that Lucy had loved in her for as long as she could remember, Your mother would have been very happy." She let go and climbed into the stage without looking back, and Lucy stood in the dust of the Dust Creek Main Street and watched the stage go until she could not see it. And the emotion she felt was not sadness, but a specific kind of fullness, the feeling of a life that is connected to the lives before it. She rode home to the homestead, to Amos, to the land. The summer of 1888 was a good summer. Not easy, no summer on a Texas homestead was easy. The work was constant and the heat was relentless, and there was always something that needed doing before it was finished, but good. The creek was running well, better than it had in 2 years, and the pasture was green longer into the season than it had been during the drought year. The cattle were putting on weight, and the garden was producing with a generosity that made Lucy feel, irrationally but persistently, that the land itself was pleased with how things had turned out. She and Amos had taken stock of the property's situation in those first weeks, seriously and systematically, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledger book and the map her father had drawn of the property boundaries, discussing what needed to be done to make the place properly productive again after the years of drought and her father's illness. Amos had ideas, thoughtful, practical ones, grounded in the years he had spent in Montana and New Mexico observing how ranches were run in difficult country. And Lucy had thoughts of her own, some of which had been forming quietly in the back of her mind for years, waiting for the circumstances in which they might be acted upon. They decided to sell half the cattle herd, which was more than the drought-thinned range could well support, and use the money to drill a proper well, which would free them from dependency on the creek in dry years. They decided to extend the orchard by another 2 rows, because the peach crop had always been their most reliable income, and the trees were healthy. They decided that in the spring they would take on a hired hand, not because they could not manage, but because 2 people cannot do everything a 240-acre property requires without exhausting themselves past usefulness, and a tired farmer was an ineffective one. They made these decisions together, across the kitchen table, in the ordinary partnership of it, and Lucy thought sometimes about the 3 days she had been given, and how much had happened in them, and how different the table looked now from the morning she had sat at it alone and cried. In October of that year, she told Amos she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast directly, because she was not someone who managed revelations dramatically. She sat down across from him with her coffee and said, "I think we are going to have a child." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her. The expression on his face went through several things very quickly: surprise, and then a kind of still, bright feeling that she recognized as a deeper version of what she had seen when she answered yes to his proposal. And then he stood up and came around the table and held her face in both hands and kissed her forehead, and then her mouth, and then her forehead again. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling?" "Very well," she said. "Somewhat tired in the mornings, otherwise entirely fine." "We should get the doctor from Abilene," he said. "We should get the midwife from Dust Creek first," she said. "Mrs. Calder has delivered half the children in this county, and I trust her considerably more than any doctor who hasn't met me." "Both, then," he said. "Both," she agreed. The baby was born in the middle of May 1889, a Tuesday morning with the creek running loud after spring rains, and Mrs. Calder presided over the birth with the calm, efficient authority of a woman who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing. Amos was in the yard because the convention of the time required it, but Mrs. Calder had relented to the extent of leaving the window open, and Lucy could hear him down there, not quite pacing but moving around in the purposeful way of a man who needs his hands to be doing something. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and furious about the world in the way of all newborns, and he was healthy, and he weighed, according to Mrs. Calder's experienced estimate, somewhere in the region of 8 pounds, and Lucy held him and looked at him with the specific, absolute astonishment that no amount of preparation reduces, and thought, "Here you are. Here is the next thing." She called Amos up from the yard, and he came into the room with the careful movements of a man walking somewhere he has never been before, and she put the baby in his arms, and she watched his face do the same thing hers had done, the astonishment, and then something deeper and quieter than astonishment, something like recognition. "Hello," Amos said to the baby, in the slightly uncertain tone of a man who is not sure the usual conversational openings apply but has nothing better to offer. The baby opened his eyes briefly, blinked with the unfocused concentration of someone encountering light for the first time, and made a small sound that was not quite a complaint and not quite its opposite. "He has your eyes," Amos said. "He has your nose," Lucy said. "That seems fair," Amos said, and he smiled, and it was the kind of smile she had never seen on him before, wide and unguarded and purely glad. And she thought that she would remember this exact moment, the May light through the window, the sound of the creek, the warm weight of the baby, Amos's face, for the rest of her life. They named him Earl James Warren, Earl for her father and James for Amos's, which settled some old distances on both sides and felt right. Earl was a cheerful, determined baby who became a cheerful, determined boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes, and who showed from early on the combined qualities of both parents, her stubbornness and his patience, her directness and his careful thinking. He followed his father around the property from the age he could walk, learning the names of things with the focused appetite of a child for whom the world is being revealed one word at a time, and he followed his mother into the kitchen and the garden with the same attentiveness, and the homestead arranged itself around him with the ease of a place that had been waiting for this. The winter of 1889 into 1890 was a hard one, cold and dry by turns, with a stretch of weeks in February that kept everyone close to the fire and wore on the nerves. But they were through it by March, and the spring came back with its usual conviction, and the orchard bloomed pink and white, and the creek came up with the snowmelt, and the world was, as it reliably was after winter, almost unbearably beautiful in its return. In the spring of 1890, they hired a hand named Eli Torres, a young man of 20 who was the son of a Mexican rancher from over the Medina River country and who had grown up with cattle and knew his work. He was quiet and skilled and reliable, and he took to the Ralston Warren place with the seriousness of someone who recognizes a well-run operation and wants to be part of it. Lucy paid him fairly and treated him with respect, which she had learned from her father to do with anyone who did honest work, and Amos worked alongside him without the kind of condescension that some men of the time would have considered their prerogative. The well was drilled that same spring, using the money from the cattle sale, and it made an immediate and obvious difference. The property was no longer at the mercy of the creek's fluctuations, and Lucy spent a considerable amount of time that summer thinking about the wells that had not been drilled on her father's property during the drought year that had led to all of it, and feeling the particular satisfaction of having fixed a structural problem rather than merely managing its symptoms. She thought about Cornelius Draper sometimes, too, though less often as the years passed. She had heard, through the reliable network of Mrs. Hennessy's information, that Draper had overextended himself on several properties in the following year and had found himself in legal difficulty, and she had received this news with neither satisfaction nor sorrow, simply with the acknowledgement that actions had consequences, which was one of the more reliable facts about the world. She thought sometimes about the 3 days. She thought about the morning she had stood on the porch and read the notice, the way the sky had been the color of a bruise, the way the world had seemed to close down to a single impossible problem. She thought about writing to Judge Harding and being told there was nothing to be done. She thought about standing on the sidewalk in the afternoon sun and hearing someone say her name. She thought about the ring on the table, the small turquoise ring that was now on her finger where it had been since the night he had put it there, worn smooth from the work of every day on the homestead. She thought about the morning he had ridden to Abilene in the early light, about the second evening when she had stood on the porch and heard the horse on the road, about Draper in the yard with his dark buggy and his flat eyes, and Garrett with his briefcase and his precise, steel-spined certainty. She thought, from 3 days of impossibility to this, to the kitchen in the morning light, to the boy in the yard who was now 4 years old and currently attempting to convince Eli Tors that there was a very good reason to put a frog in the feed bucket, to the orchard filling out beyond the window, to Amos at the table with his coffee, reading the paper that came from San Antonio 3 days late and was still better than nothing. She thought, here, this is the thing that happened. In the fall of 1891, she discovered she was pregnant again. She told Amos in the same direct way she had told him the first time, at breakfast, with her coffee, and he responded in almost exactly the same way. The still, bright surprise of it, the immediacy of his concern for her, the wide, unguarded smile that she now recognized as one of her favorite things in the world. The baby was born in June of 1892, another morning delivery, again attended by Mrs. Calder, who remained unimpressed and efficient throughout. And this time the baby was a girl, with a full head of dark hair and an expression of focused dissatisfaction with the world that Mrs. Calder said was very healthy indeed. Lucy held her daughter and thought, here you are too. They named her Ruth Clara Warren, Clara for the aunt in Galveston who received a telegram and a letter, and wrote back a reply that was entirely characteristic, practical, affectionate, sharp-edged, and containing, toward the end, a sentence that simply said, I told you he could work. The implication being, apparently, that this was the most important thing she had predicted, and that it had been borne out satisfactorily. Earl, at 3 years old, received his sister with the mixed feelings of someone whose established order has been disrupted. He spent approximately 2 weeks being suspicious of her, and then decided, with the pragmatic adaptability of children, that she was going to be there regardless and might as well be incorporated into his world. He taught her things with the proprietary satisfaction of an older brother, and she, as soon as she was old enough to do so, did everything her own way instead, which seemed to satisfy them both. The homestead in those years had the particular quality of a place that is being lived in fully. The garden always growing something, the kitchen always smelling of something, the yard always occupied by some combination of children and animals, and the work that a working property generated in constant supply. The peach orchard produced reliably, and Lucy had expanded the preserved fruit operation to the point where she had a standing arrangement to supply the general store in Dust Creek and another store in the next town, which brought in steady income that added its own layer of stability. Amos had expanded the cattle herd carefully, over several years, choosing quality over quantity in a way that required patience but produced better returns. He had also, in the fall of 1891, negotiated a grazing agreement with 2 neighboring ranchers that allowed all 3 properties to rotate their herds across a shared section of range, which benefited everyone and had required a considerable amount of careful conversation to arrange. But Amos was very good at careful conversation. He was a good man. She had known this, in the careful way she had known many things about him during those years when she had held the knowledge at a certain distance. But knowing it fully, in the context of a life actually built together, was different. He was patient with the children in the way of someone who had thought about what patience really meant, and had decided to practice it rather than merely aspire to it. He was honest in his dealings with everyone they had dealings with, not in a rigid or righteous way, but in the simple way of someone for whom honesty was just how things worked, and anything else required too much management. He worked as hard as he asked anyone else to work, which was a quality Lucy had seen in her father and had come to understand was not as common as it should be. He also continued to be funny, in the dry, observational way, and she continued to catch it and find it genuinely pleasing, and this had not changed in 4 years of marriage, which she thought was more meaningful than most people gave it credit for. He was, she thought sometimes, watching him in the evenings on the porch, exactly the right person. Not a perfect person. He could be stubborn in a way that occasionally produced genuine friction, and he had a tendency to solve problems silently inside his own head before mentioning them, which required her to occasionally ask directly what he was working out, and why he hadn't said so, but perfectly the right person for her, for this life, for this land. Judge Harding died in the fall of 1892 and was replaced by a younger man, and Dust Creek grew by a small hotel and 2 new businesses in the following year. And the railroad that had been discussed for as long as anyone could remember finally came through a town 30 miles to the north, which changed the economics of cattle shipping enough to matter. Reverend Cobb retired from the church in 1893 and was replaced by a younger minister who was enthusiastic and well-intentioned, and Cobb himself lived quietly in a small house on the edge of town, occasionally appearing for services with the serene expression of a man who had said all the important things already, and was content to hear them said by someone else for a while. Lucy went to see him sometimes, on Sundays after services, and they would drink tea on his porch and talk about whatever was on the table of the week. And she felt in these conversations the particular ease of someone who has known another person for a long time and through important things, and she treasured them. In the spring of 1894, she and Amos sat down at the kitchen table with the ledger book and the property map and went through the numbers very carefully, and the numbers were good, better than good. 6 years of careful, consistent work had built something solid, a debt-free property, a productive orchard, a well-maintained herd, a steady supplementary income from the preserved fruit, and $48 that had become, over those years, something considerably larger in a proper bank account in Abilene. Not wealthy, not by any stretch, but solvent and growing, which was all her father had ever asked of the land and more than he had managed to achieve before the drought year had come for him. She thought about him as she sat there with the ledger. She thought about him in the spring of 1871, arriving with a mule and a plow and a dream, and she thought about what he had built, and she thought about what had almost been taken, and she thought about what it had become. She thought he would have liked Amos, liked him without reservation, would have approved of the steady work and the dry humor and the careful thinking. They had worked together for 3 years, and she thought her father had already liked him, had seen what was there to see, had probably known, in the way that old men who have paid attention to life sometimes know things about the people around them, that this was the shape of what was going to happen. She thought, I am glad it happened. I am glad of every part of it, even the hard parts, even the 3 days. She put the ledger down and went and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking out at the yard where Earl, now 5, was helping Eli Torres with something involving the fence of the chicken pen, with the earnest incompetence of a boy who is very sure he knows what he is doing. Ruth, 2 years old, was sitting in the dirt nearby with the focused concentration of a toddler, engaged in some private project, whose nature was not immediately apparent, but was clearly of significant importance to her. Amos came up behind her and put his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head, and they stood like that in the doorway, looking at the yard and the orchard beyond it and the east pasture glowing copper in the morning light. The numbers are good, she said. They are, he said. My father would have been pleased, she said. He would, he said. He would have been very pleased. She felt the solid warmth of him around her, and she thought about the ring on her finger, the turquoise blue of it in the morning light, and she thought about 3 days, and about all the days that had followed them, and about the days that were still ahead, stretching out before them as wide and unhurried as the Texas plain. Earl had come across the yard toward them now, attracted by the stillness of his parents in the doorway in the way that children are always attracted to stillness, which seems to them to promise something. He stopped in front of them and looked up with his mother's directness and his father's gray eyes and said, "What are you looking at?" "Everything," Lucy said. He considered this. "That's a lot," he said. "It is," Amos agreed, "but we have time for it." Earl accepted this with the reasonable pragmatism of someone who has found that his father's statements generally make sense even when they take a moment to arrive at, and turned and went back to the fence project, which required his immediate attention. Ruth looked up from her patch of dirt, noticed that her brother was returning, and returned to her own business with the satisfaction of someone whose world is correctly ordered. The creek talked to itself in the distance. The peach trees, full and leafed out in early spring green, moved slightly in the morning wind. The sky over Dust Creek, Texas, was clear and high, and entirely without a bruise in it, blue and bright and open, the way it looked when it was being honest about what it was capable of, which was, on its best days, everything. Lucy Ralston Warren stood in the doorway of her father's house, which was her house, with her husband's arms around her and her children in the yard and 6 years of built life behind her and all the years ahead, and she thought, this is the thing that 3 days made possible. This is the whole of it, and it was good. It was more than good, it was exactly everything.